I'm always a little nervous doing these live streams because anything can go wrong, but I really appreciate you guys being here. So I just wanted to kick off and say welcome, and hope you guys are doing well and staying healthy and safe. So for those of you who are just joining in with this channel for the first time, my name's Tom Froese, and I'm an illustrator, designer, taught teacher on Skillshare. And I have this YouTube channel where I answer your guys' questions about illustration. And it's just a nice way of kind of gathering up all the answers that I've given over the years. And so, yeah, welcome here. And so just quick little rundown of how I'll do this. I did have some people sending questions kind of before over the last week through Instagram. So I'm going to go through those questions first, just because I've kind of formulated answers. And once I've kind of gone through those, I will then start going through the live chat, and I'll let you know when that part starts so you can ask your question and I'll catch it. If you ask your question right now, it's going to get buried in all the comments, and so I might miss it. So stay tuned, and yeah, let's kind of just get going. I just wanted to give you a quick update about what's going on here. Things with me and my family, we're all doing well. Everybody's safe. We really are like super introverted people, so it almost feels, we kind of joke that it feels like nothing's changed for us. But yeah, I feel like for the most part, we're not really, you know, obviously we're in a sort of light version of lockdown, and we don't go hobby shopping, and we're washing our hands a lot more. But right now things are definitely, I'd say, compared to, I think, the way a lot of the world is going through this, we're actually doing pretty good. So we're very thankful for that. Yeah, I hope you guys are well. Where are you guys all coming from? I'd love to see where you guys are coming from here. I see that Polly is coming from San Francisco. I've seen someone from Austin. Just curious about where you guys are all. Chicago. Thanks, Christy. All right, well, Asheville, North Carolina, Norway, awesome. Italy, Yukon, Germany, Singapore, UK. All right, here they all come. Germany, UK, Denver, Colorado, Hungary, Russia, Vancouver. Nice, and local people here too. Minneapolis, awesome, guys. Well, welcome to the world. Yeah, anyway, I had a few updates. I want to get right into questions because I think they're going to take a long time to answer. But I just wanted to just do a quick update about Sweet Spots, which is my latest class on Skillshare. Guys, I released this class in February, so it's been about 2 months, and the class is blown up. You guys have really been doing amazing projects on it. And so there's almost 200 projects, almost 10,000 students in just 2 months. And I encourage you guys, if you haven't done it already, go to the Skillshare, go to my Skillshare page, skillshare.com/TomFroese. You can find Sweet Spots there, and just check out the projects that students have been doing. They're amazing. I'm just super impressed at how you guys have taken the information that I've given in the class and really just really embraced those principles and actually kind of developed your own personal styles. It's really encouraging just to see how you guys did that. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you guys for embracing Sweet Spots so heartily since it's been launched, and I'm really thankful for that. So thank you very much. Okay, so should we get into the questions? I'll answer on everyone's behalf. Yes, I think we should. Okay, so I'm just gonna start with this first question comes from Sketchy Ted, and he says that I struggle with balancing time between my client work and my personal work. Client work usually has a clear deadline and a defined budget, where for personal work, I'm the only one expecting it, and the investment, I'm the only one for whom investment is a risk. I'm trying to paraphrase this. So basically he's asking, how do you make sure you are investing time in personal work without kind of it falling by the wayside while you're scrambling to get your client work done? So I think personally for me, when I'm doing a personal project, unless I make it matter as much as my client projects, it's not going to happen. So the way I do that is I create a project that if I'm doing a personal project, say if I'm doing a poster or a print or some greeting cards, something that I want to make for me. A great example for me is my annual Christmas cards that I make. I design them, I illustrate them, and then I have them letterpress printed. So there's a deadline involved there, and the only client is me. But because I have this deadline, it feels like a real project. I have to get them done in time to mail out for Christmas. And so that's a really good example of a personal project that becomes real for me. Now, I think in order to approach personal work, I guess what you mean by personal work might be different than what I define as personal work. I mean, maybe personal work just means keeping a sketchbook or drawing more, in which case you probably want to have defined goals here where if your personal project is just to draw more, you probably won't draw more because it's not a specific enough goal. You need to say, I'm going to draw for 15 minutes every day and post what I make on Instagram. Suddenly you have a deliverable to hold yourself accountable to, and then you make it matter more to you. So I'd say in summary, make concrete goals for your personal projects. I'd say make a connection from your projects to your financial or creative bottom line. What I mean by that is, if you have a project that seems creative, but it doesn't seem to matter to your bottom line as a business, you may not feel like it's as important. But if you say, I need to learn how to get better at this skill, so I'm going to do this project and get better at it, and this is going to amount to me actually, having more earning potential or being more efficient or whatever it is, link your personal project to something critical to your actual success as a business. And yeah, I think just have personal projects that actually matter and contribute to your professional life. So thanks, Sketchy Ted, for your question. And I'm going to move on to the next one. This one comes from Study Snack Studio. They ask, hi, Tom, do you have any tips for practicing lettering or typography? I'm secretly hoping you lead a new class on this topic. Thanks so much. I'm really enjoying your Skillshare classes and love your content. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah, lettering and typography. This is something I've been playing around with as a class idea as well. Hopefully it will come in the future. And yes, I do incorporate lettering a lot in my illustration. And I think actually as illustrators, if you can get good at lettering and even get better at using type and understanding typography, I think that sets you apart. It gives you an extra edge as an illustrator. Not every illustrator has had the opportunity to get into lettering or typography and understand the shape of letters specifically and how to make those. So I think it's a great question, and I think that you do well to study it. I'd say one of the best single starting points for anyone interested in learning lettering and type is to actually start with the basics. Start by just learning how to use a speedball nib pen and ink, and get a book. This is like an old classic that I have. It's a speedball textbook, and it has basically lettering styles and kind of tips for how to construct letter forms in it and how to hold the pen and stuff like that. You might be asking, what does this have to do with illustration or lettering? This is just, some old-fashioned book with you know, this is very relevant. Just to kind of answer my own question, it gives you step-by-step instructions on how to construct your letter forms, and that is the key here. Is for me, even though my lettering and my own work is very kind of whimsical and naive, hopefully you can see that I have an understanding of the structure of letters. And that comes from studying things like this, where they actually show you how to build a letter, doing the downstroke and then adding the extra details and stuff like that, thicks and thins, and how to do squiggles. These things are all very technical and technique based. And so to just understand how those things are built up through a sort of, tradition like this, something that has been around for a while, you learn a lot. And I think another thing just to differentiate is that you've talked about lettering and typography. And these things are two very different things. So typography is, well, let's just say there's lettering and type. So lettering is just, using, building letters, basically drawing letters. So imagine just like bubble letters is a form of lettering, or calligraphy is a form of lettering. But then there's type, which is using fonts basically, or typefaces that these are pre-made little letters that you put together, and you can choose from a font that has either a serif or a sans serif and stuff like that. So that's type, and typography is how you use type. So typography is is your line of type centered? Is it flush left? How are your line spaces and stuff like that. So there's lots in there. Typography is this whole other thing. But I'd say as a starting point, I'd say, again, get a speedball textbook or lettering manual. There's all kinds of stuff like this available. I think you could even get them at your local art store. And I have a few. I'm doing a bit of a book show and tell here. So let's see. This is, if you want to learn more about type, this is a bit of an older edition, but Alan Lepton's Thinking with Type is a good textbook. It is a bit kind of studenty, meaning that it's very focused on the design or art school student, but it's written in such a way that you can definitely learn so much from it. It's the kind of thing that when you first read it, you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, this is too much information. But stay with it. Typography and lettering are just like crazy Pandora's boxes of knowledge. And some of you, if you're just getting into it for the first time, something will ignite for you, and maybe you'll actually find that you have a passion for type, just because of how many details and how much there is in that world. So I definitely really got into type kind of early on in my journey toward learning to be a creative, and that passion I had for it gave me the ability to kind of just absorb all the, like, I was just passionate about it, so I learned a lot about it, is what I'm saying. And because I learned a lot about it, I bring that into my illustration. I know how to create letters because I understand how letter forms are constructed. And what I wanted to say, and this is kind of bringing it full circle, is when I wanted to differentiate between type and lettering. When you know what type is and how typefaces are made, I'm talking about sans serif, serif, slab serif, grotesque, transitional, modern. These things that sound abstract just to name off, but when you know what each of those letter forms look like, you can actually create those by hand. I'm not saying you're going to make perfect typefaces by hand, but you can mimic the qualities of those, and how those letters are constructed, and that can really give you a much more informed edge to your lettering as an illustrator. And just one more note, old school illustrators from back in the day, they didn't have computers with fonts on them. They would have to draw their fonts if they were doing something for an advertisement or whatever it was. So they actually had this built-in understanding of letter forms, and that's what made them kind of inherently good lettering artists back in the day. And I said that was my final thing, but I had actually one more thing to say, which is I did mention learning how to use a speedball, nib pen, and construct letters like that, but also sign painting. Sign painting is obviously an art in its own, but you can learn so much about how letters are constructed just by watching a sign painter at work, and even just learning a little bit of the lingo. They have things like, say, downstrokes or upstrokes, and just that consistency. Like you might have a whole alphabet of letters that are all made using just upstrokes predominantly, and just that consistent upstroke of technique used brings a consistency to that particular kind of lettering style. And one name I have for sign painters is Bob Dewhurst. I'd say just look him up on YouTube and go down that rabbit hole and enjoy. So thank you very much for that question. And yeah, I'll just move on to the next one. So this one comes from Pallavi Pandey, and they say, I wanted to ask this question because I personally face this problem a lot as I'm exploring a vast amount of illustration styles when I illustrate. And sometimes I feel like maybe I'm copying the artist I get inspired from. And this feeling overwhelms me and I get stuck in the process. So how to deal with this kind of issue? So this is a huge thing. And I actually made an entire talk about how to be influenced by your inspiration, or how to be inspired by your influences without imitating them. So check out that talk. It's called How to Harness Your Inspiration Without Imitating It. But also, if you're on Skillshare, check out my recent class, Sweet Spots. I have kind of the front section of Sweet Spots is a whole primer section. And there's one video called Primer Inspiration versus Imitation, where I kind of address this. It's a very short clip, so I don't go into too much depth about it. But my quick summary of that video and of my whole approach to imitation versus influence is to imitate to learn, innovate to earn. And that means at first, you almost have to imitate. You have to imitate the people you admire, and in order to learn. Just for instance, let's just say you find a kid's book illustrator, and you, for the first time, are like, I want to do that. So that style of that kid's book illustrator is probably the style you have in your mind that you want to do. And what is your natural response to that inspiration, that initial spark that you get? You want to copy that person. And I think that's 100% okay. Obviously, you're not going to go like the next day and get a job with a magazine and illustrate in that person's style, or you're not going to go and write a whole kid's book in that style and totally imitate and copy that person. It doesn't work like that. You're going to be probably not very good at doing that style, especially if you're beginning at illustration. But as you go along, you're going to learn things. You're going to say, oh, and you're going to ask questions. You're going to say, oh, what brush did they use, or what technique, or what software? How did they do this? How did they do that? Just by imitating, you start to ask these questions, and you start to unlock a whole slew of learning and discovery. And that's really how we get started learning and getting inspired. And then over time, your influence becomes a little bit removed from your initial influences, if that makes sense. So any illustrator today that seems to have their own style that's not imitated, if you trace back into the past, you'll probably see that they started quite differently, and quite differently from where they are today, but quite similar to the people they were influenced by. And this is definitely the case for me. I totally imitated, copied illustrators that I love. I think my main references that I was inspired by were kind of illustrators from the past, so I wasn't at risk of like offending anyone by copying them. And I think it somehow seems more permissible to copy an illustrator from the past, say like Mary Blair or Paul Rand, or that kind of thing. You know you're not going to get called out for copying them, because I think everyone copies those people. But then if I were to copy Olympia Zanioli today, who's an amazing current illustrator, if I were to just rip off her style, people would see that, and I think that's a lot different. But either way, even if I was copying Olympia Zanioli just to learn, I think that's okay, and I feel like she would agree to that. It's as long as you don't show it as your own work, and as long as you're not like posting it in a way that looks like you did it, and then people might say, well, Olympia, did you do that? She would look at it and go, no, I didn't make that. That's weird. It looks a lot like mine. You know, then in that case, maybe you're getting too close to imitating without it being innovated on. That's my next point. So like I said, we imitate to learn. And if you go back in history of any illustrator, including me, you're going to see that there's more imitation involved. And then that influence becomes more and more further removed as you go along. And you kind of almost start referencing yourself. In my own experience, I've created a sort of library, a repertoire of symbols and ways of drawing things that I now can just go and draw from. And it feels like I'm just creating this all on my own, but these kind of have their origin in something else. It's just that I've kind of crystallized all that influence into my own little language that I now use in my own illustration. So in terms of the innovating side of things, I think what you want to do when you're imitating is look at what it is you're influenced by or inspired by in someone's style. Is it their technique? Is it their use of color? Do you like how they use texture? Is it the feeling they have, something kind of more ephemeral, something you can't really like exactly touch or point at? Whatever that is, lean into that. Say, I really like the way this person only uses clean vectors to build their artwork. And then you can kind of start to say, but what can I bring to the vector style? Maybe it's you only use diagonal lines. I don't know. Something like that. You basically want to say, what is it about this person's work that I love? How can I kind of take that to the next level for me and add something of my own to it? So there's a whole bunch of stuff I could get into there. And in the interest of time, I'll cut myself off here. But hopefully that helps. And like I said, I do actually have a whole talk about, how I harness inspiration without imitating it. So please check that out, and please check out Sweet Spots where I also address that. So thank you very much for your question. So the next question comes from Suba, and Suba asks, I'm going to just summarize her question first, which is, how do I find my style? And this is the single most asked question by illustrators ever in history. So, and it's totally, there's a reason why people are asking this question. It's very much related to the question I just talked about imitation. Having a style is really important for illustrators. And I think some people poo-poo the question of style and think that it's unimportant, but I really think that it's super important. I mean, that's why we're all asking it. Style is your signature, it's your trademark, it's your identity, it's your calling card. If you've taken, and I guess I have to share with you guys the resources that I've already made on this. If you've taken my classes, either Odd Bodies or Sweet Spots on Skillshare, you'll see that I talk a lot about style, and I'm really trying to get at this question in these classes from different angles. So please definitely check out those classes. In Odd Bodies, for instance, I talk about stylization of human figures specifically, like how do you draw people? How do you approach the style of drawing people? And then in Sweet Spots, I really talk about, what is style? What are the elements of style? How do you put them together and mix and match them to create cohesive sets of illustrations? How do you have a consistent style? I also recommend checking out, there's a book I have a little book here called Find Your Artistic Voice. And I just bought this a few months ago. It's a book by Lisa Congdon. She's amazing, very popular on Instagram, and she's also a teacher on Skillshare. And this is a great book. What I like about it is it really approaches the idea of style from the idea of voice. And I think a lot of people, a lot of illustrators actually prefer to use the term voice over style, because style can seem kind of skin deep. It can seem kind of just like surfacey, like, oh, I want to work in a vector style or a clean style or a vintage style. It seems very surfacey, but voice comes from deep within. This is something I say sometimes, that style is skin deep, voice comes from deep within. In my own style or in my own work, a lot of you'll see a lot of variation, and especially over time, like stuff that I was making 3 years ago is quite different from now, and there's this evolution. And I find it hard to reconcile what I did 3 years ago with what I do today and see it as the same style. But I can definitely see it as the same voice. It's all coming from me. It all comes from my sense of humor, from my perspective. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I have this really cheesy thing. I'm just going to read what I wrote as an answer to this question. And so forgive me if it's going to sound scripted, and it's super cheesy as well, but I'm just going to go. And again, we're talking about, how do I find my style? So finding your style is not the same as finding toothpaste at the drugstore or finding the perfect picnic spot at the beach. It's more like finding love. I know that sounds cheesy, but it's just about that abstract. When you're looking for love, you have an inkling or a tug at your heart, but you don't know where it's leading you. And you don't really know what or who you're looking for. But that pull at your heart leads you to search for love. It's not like you're popping into shops and houses throughout the city looking for a specific person saying, "Are you there? Are you there?" Rather, you're just tuned into a frequency. You're in a state of readiness. It's always running in the background, this pursuit, even when you're not really paying attention. Many people perhaps could be the person you fall in love with. It's less about finding this one person who is right, and we're talking about style, so it's less about finding this one style that's right, and more about being open to possibility and seeing that potential in more people. It's that combination of being tuned in or searching and having an open heart that is being receptive to potential for love. You also have better chances of finding love or your style when you go out and make opportunities to do so. So in the analogy of love, we're talking about putting yourself in situations where you'll meet new people, whether that's online or out in the wild. Finding your style comes from being tuned in, actively going out and making opportunities to find it. So studying, practicing, doing the work. And I think most importantly, you need to have an open heart to find connections or potential in styles you're playing with. So at this early stage, the important thing for anyone trying to find their style would just be to get your hands dirty. Try to get different techniques, both digital and physical. Take classes that teach techniques. Find illustrators you admire and study their work. Find out who their influences are, and we talked about this in the last question. Find out what techniques they use, and then try your hand at them. And I think really importantly, give yourself permission to be bad at it. Be willing to be bad at it, especially at first. Learn what you're good at. Learn what you're not so good at. Learn what you love and learn what you don't love. You're going to find people who are your type and people who aren't your type. And it's the same in finding your style. Circle around the techniques and styles that give you the most satisfaction. Don't try to be a style that you're not. Don't try to have a style that you're not good at or you don't like or you won't enjoy yourself. So just because it's trendy and you feel like it's what people want or it's all the rage right now. Don't feel like you have to do it if you don't like it or if it's not you. So if all this sounds super laborious, guys, like it's going to take you too much time, I'm afraid that there are no shortcuts to finding your style. It's a journey and it takes time and effort. And I'm not going to lie, it takes a lot of frustration and discouragement. So I know I just kind of read a bit of a scripty thing there, but there was so much in there that I didn't want to miss when I wrote it last night. And I just think that it really is, finding your style is not just something you can go and be like, I want to do it in that style. You pick it and then you do it. And of course, I want to acknowledge that the hardest thing at first is simply not knowing what finding your style even means. So hopefully in this, I've given you a bit of a starting point and something to kind of sink your teeth into and move forward from, to mix a bunch of weird metaphors. So yeah. Moving on to the next question is from Andrew. And Andrew, I was going to read the whole name, but I couldn't pronounce it. So Andrew asks, basically, hey Tom, I'm new to illustration and I'm using Procreate on an iPad Pro. I wanted to get the Photoshop app on my iPad Pro, but I don't have a desktop. I think Photoshop is industry standard. So should I invest in a desktop so I could have Photoshop, or will I get by just using Procreate? So basically the question this person is asking, is Photoshop a must-have for illustrators? And kind of further to that, right now they're working only on an iPad, and they wonder, should they invest in getting a desktop so they can actually run full Photoshop on it? And the short answer is no. I don't think you need Photoshop. You don't need, today you have so many options for programs that, there's just so many different routes. So I don't want to be super black and white, say you must have Photoshop. If you take my classes and you see what I make and how I make things, yes, I absolutely need Photoshop. It's how I work. It's a program I'm most comfortable in. It's a very powerful program. But more and more, I'm seeing that there are other competing apps, and the iPad is getting more and more capable of doing things that were previously the domain of the desktop or laptop computer. There's Affinity Photo and Affinity Designer, which are very competitive to the Adobe programs. I'm a little bit unclear about whether someone should use Designer or Photo, Affinity Designer or Photo for certain kinds of illustration, because I think there's a lot of overlap in those, just in the same way that Photoshop and Illustrator have a lot of overlap. But if you want to stick to your iPad and you want to use something that's kind of more Photoshop-y, Fresco is a new app that just came out, and it's sort of it's more of, I think it's meant to be Adobe's answer to Procreate. So it probably incorporates some things that you know from Photoshop, but then incorporates a lot of things that you love about Procreate as well. I'd say if you want to see if Photoshop is working for you, rather than go out and invest a whole bunch in a new computer that you may not need, and then getting the Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, maybe there's a way of trying it first. Right now is not a good time for this kind of thing because of because of the pandemic. So it's not like you can go to, I don't know, is there a place like a library where you can go and use Photoshop, or a friend's house and just play around on their Photoshop? Basically what I'm saying is, if at all possible, find a way of, trying Photoshop on a desktop, seeing how you like it before investing in it. But of course that might be very tricky right now and everyone's kind of in lockdown. I do know that there is actually a web-based Photoshop as well. So if you do have access to a laptop or a desktop somehow, and you want to try Photoshop, there's I'm going to just quickly actually check it out now for you guys. It's like a web browser based Photoshop, and it's called Photopea. That's it, Photopea. And that is actually, I've played around in it, and I've even recommended it to clients I've made digital assets using Photoshop with, and they don't have Photoshop. So, and I just say, just use Photopea if you need to like open the file and change a color or whatever, and it works. So hope that answers your question. Basically, long story short, Photoshop has been an industry standard in a way for a lot of things, but I just don't think it's like that anymore. I think a lot of people are sticking just to their tablets and finding ways of just using those on their own. But of course, experiment, play around as much as you can, and see, just see what's possible. So thank you for your question. Okay, so this question comes from Hannah.Amanda on Instagram, and she's asking how she can niche down to spot illustration and advice, and just wondering if I have any advice or tips for adding spot illustrations to a portfolio. And so I think the question here is basically, if you want to develop if you want to be an illustrator that focuses on spot illustrations, you want to get more work in that space, how do you do that? So this is always the question of, I mean, the bigger question here is, how do you get work when you're starting as an illustrator? Or maybe how do you get work in a field that you're currently not recognized in? How do you get into that space? How do you get your foot in the door? And I would say, find magazines or publications that are hiring illustrations to make spot illustrations. Find magazines that include spot illustrations regularly. And I mean, just off the top of my head, Monocle magazine does a lot of spot illustration. I do a lot of spot illustrations for GQ France, just for instance. And you know, so the first step is just seeing where spot illustrations exist, who's hiring, and then create a list of magazines that you would love to create spot illustrations for, and kind of have your A, B, and C list. So your A list would be your dream client, someone that if you're a beginner would be like less likely as a client. B would be, you know, kind of a little bit more likely, and C would be like low-hanging fruit. You do it if you had to for the experience, and so find and so a range like that might be, for instance, New Yorker magazine might be on your A list, and you want to do a spot illustration for the New Yorker, and then on the other end, your C list would be maybe a local 2-color printed publication that someone hands out on the bus or something like that. So you have these two wildly different spaces, but they're both doing spot illustrations. And the only way to grow in any field is to be doing the work. And usually the only way to enter is at the bottom. Like if you're entering a skyscraper and you want to get to the top floor, you need to come in through the lobby entrance. So I just say, look at that, but you also, just further to that analogy, you know, your goal is to get to the top of the skyscraper. That's everybody's goal. So have that goal, set it, name it, say, I want to do spots for the New Yorker or New York Times, or get something in Monocle or whatever it is. And then have more realistic goals. And maybe your C list, your realistic goals are just doing, you know, spot illustrations for your a magazine that you've made up. So the important thing here is you just need to start getting that experience and making your things. And in terms of getting more work like that, you want to start biasing your portfolio to show that you do spot illustrations. So if you want to do spot illustrations, if you want art directors to consider you for that kind of job, then you need to kind of already be selling that, and for them to say, oh, so-and-so does spot illustrations, let me hire them for this job. So basically put more of that work up on your portfolio as you have it. So hope that helps. Thank you so much for your question. And just gonna move on to the next question. First, have a sip of coffee. Guys, thanks for sticking around. I'm about 3/4 of the way through the Instagram questions, and then I'll start answering the YouTube questions. We might be here a little longer than the hour allotted if you guys are able to stick around for that. So appreciate your patience. There's just so much here that I wanted to get into, and I just love getting into the details of these questions. So let's keep going. So this next question comes from Pujana, and I really hope I'm not butchering your name, but the summary of the question is, what are your thoughts on open source editable illustrations? In the past year, I've seen a lot of such illustrations released into the market, and they are pretty well designed. How would this affect illustrators? Wouldn't clients prefer these affordable illustrations rather than hiring an illustrator for custom art? And you know, I've seen little inklings of this in the last few months, just like kind of trendy looking illustrations that you might see for a tech website, usually character based, so people, kind of simple stuff that you might actually like see. Like I feel like my Odd Bodies class kind of teaches this kind of style where it's like exaggerated bodies and not realistic. And I think this is just becoming more trendy, this style of illustration with people, and it being very kind of quirky and whimsical and playing around with shapes of people and not being totally literal and anatomically correct and all that. And so I've just seen this as a trend in the tech space in general. And now I've seen websites that are offering either for sale or for free this kind of illustration style as stock art. But it's more than stock illustration. It's modular. It's something you can open up in Sketch or XD and actually like change out body parts and stuff like that. So I was just playing around with this the other day, just in response to this question, because I hadn't really given it a look before. I was just kind of like, oh, that, you know, that's interesting. But now I actually kind of opened it up, downloaded Sketch. I'd never used Sketch before. Downloaded XD, which is kind of Adobe's answer to Sketch. It's basically the same program. And you can like literally like create, like you download a library of illustrated people, and then you can mix and match who's in the scene, what their gender is, what their skin color is, what hairstyle they have, whether they have a hoodie or a lab coat. Like you can just swap these things out, and the illustrations look really good. One of the main guys in this space is what's his name? Pablo Stanley. And so again, I just discovered this guy. He's making some pretty amazing modular stock illustration. And this is the thing that this question is getting at. I was like, is this a threat to illustrators? Because now let's just say I could have been your client and I just wanted some illustrations of fun people doing lifestyle things like sitting on the bed, scrolling on an iPhone or something like that. I can actually go and find that illustration for free and change the colors to suit my brand. So it's sort of like, does that put us illustrators out of a job? And I think it's a very important question to ask, and it's an opportunity for us as illustrators to ask ourselves, what is our value as creatives? Are we there just making things, making pretty pictures, just making styled objects? Is that our value? Or is our value something deeper, like our perspective or our voice? Is it something in our technique that, at least for now, can't be touched by an automated or stock system? And so that's the first thing. I mean, when I see these things, it does cross my mind, like, oh, now like clients aren't gonna like need me to make their illustration for their tech website, but maybe someone who would just want trendy illustration that's kind of impersonal and a little bit vague or general and not specific to their actual brand, maybe someone who would go for that isn't my ideal client anyway. Maybe my ideal client is someone who wants me to inject something personal in my work. And that doesn't mean I'm going and like making making everything totally like exactly the way I want it, you know, or making everyone look like me or something like that. But the point is, like, I'm being invited as an illustrator to collaborate with my client to convey messages through images, to connect people to their brands through some feeling or flavor in the work that I'm making. And I believe that I bring something to that personally, uniquely, and not just uniquely for me, but like me on that job that I'm working for and with that client in that particular time is special. There's something unrepeatable there that I'll never do again. And that for me is what I believe. And further to that, I actually believe that more, just as important as style is, and being good at making illustrations is my ability to have concepts, my ability to think about images as visual problems and thinking around solutions to those things. Basically, on the conceptual side, you know, what am I bringing? And if you're using these stock illustrations, as fun and cool as they are, they can only be this thing that was made this one time. They don't respond directly to the needs of a project or a particular client in a particular time. So I think it does, these kinds of things do threaten a lot of illustrators whose work would be just being technical hands in making images. But I don't think that more experienced illustrators who are used to bringing more of their personality into things, I believe that they're going to be less affected by this kind of thing. So just trying to see what else I had written about this. I mean, personally, I was really impressed by Pablo Stanley's work and by the systems that this person is making, the systems of illustrations that you can download for free. And I highly recommend you check it out. It's really cool and fun to play around with, and you can maybe even learn a lot as an illustrator about how illustrations are constructed in just terms of like vectors and body parts coming together and stuff like that. But I think one note is the person, look at the big picture of what's happening here. Pablo Stanley, I'm using him specifically as an example here because he's the example that I was shown. If you look at his website and the work that he's doing, he's making these things. He's not threatened by the product he's making. He's not putting himself out of a job. And the reason is that he's more than just making these images. He's making the system. He's obviously more in the tech space. He's probably doing more almost like, I wouldn't say coding, but he's like doing user interface design and stuff like that. Like, and he's making products. He's being entrepreneurial. I think that's really what I'm getting at, is like he's a highly creative person who's making not only illustrations for this one thing, but he's got lots of different ideas and he's very entrepreneurial. He's making these free products that other people will benefit from. They'll also attribute back to him. It's going to generate more work for him. So I think really people who want to stay in the game and not be threatened by stock music, stock photography, stock illustration, AI, all these things, is that you're more entrepreneurial. You're thinking big picture. You're thinking about how can I use my creativity to make things that really address people's needs. And I think that's just a really interesting thing to think about, is the fact that here he is, an illustrator type person, possibly creating a product that will put him out of his own job. But no, he's still like over all those things, and he's making lots of creative ventures and opportunities for himself. And I would encourage you to be inspired by that, not by his product, but by, how he operates. So I hope that helps. And still going through the Instagram questions, guys. This next question is an important one, especially now as we're all kind of in lockdown and at home and working from home, whereas a lot of us might have been working out of a space or studio or even in-house at a company. So Isabella from Germany asks, "Dear Tom, I read about your upcoming Q&A on YouTube, and I want to ask you some questions. Do you have office hours as an illustrator? I'm about to put my phone number on my website, and I was wondering if it will happen that people will call at night or on the weekends. Do you have weekends as an illustrator? Like, do you take them? My art teachers at school told us about magazines which needed an illustration as soon as possible, and they had to work through the night. Is this for real?" So thank you, Isabella, for your question. And the short answer is yes, I keep hours, and yes, I take weekends off. And I think your concerns are valid, that if you put your phone number and contact information on your website for the world to see, clients could very well say, "Oh, they're available. I'll call them. It's 8:30 p.m. I'll just call them up and see if they can get me an illustration by tomorrow." Now, I'd say, just to help you quell your concerns about being called at that time, just put your operating hours on your website. Just say, hours 9 to 5. You may very well work outside those hours, but as far as they're concerned, you work 9 to 5. That's what I do. Like I actually stick to hours basically these days it's between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Those are my working hours. Those are the hours in which I get to focus on doing what I do, whatever that looks like. Sometimes it's actually working on an illustration. Sometimes it's reading a book. Sometimes it's going for a run. But it's all sort of like my dedicated time where I have permission to say no to other things, including family. There has to be time when I am allowed to just focus. And you need that focus time as an artist. And you need that space to it doesn't always look like you're actually like head down drawing or typing or something like that. But in terms of keeping regular hours with your clients, I'd say they probably expect to have regular hours themselves. And so I don't think they're going to be upset at you for keeping the same hours as them. Yes, there are some cases where you'll be called by an art director at a magazine, for instance, with a rush job, and that hopefully is an exception. I do know that there are some people who actually, that is their normal mode of operation, is just taking fast editorial jobs and working through the night, stuff like that. And if you don't have a family and you have more time and flexibility like that, maybe you like that. Maybe you thrive off that fast-paced atmosphere. I don't, I never have. And I have taken on the odd rush job, but my timelines for work actually typically are more like 2 weeks or more. And I just say no to jobs that ask me to work faster. I don't do my best work when I'm working fast. I'm a planner, and I like to kind of experiment first and have space to just make a lot of mistakes, and then come out a few days later and see those mistakes for what they are, and then improve on them with new insight. And I need time to do that. And I also just like bigger jobs. Bigger jobs usually pay more, and they usually give you more time. So I've just sort of filtered out those kinds of jobs that kind of inconvenience me and expect me to work weird hours when everyone else is at home sleeping or having a weekend. To this point, I also, whenever a client suggests that I have a deadline on Monday, they'll say, oh, okay, we'd love to see this on Monday or next Monday or whatever. I say, well, can we move this timeline to Tuesday? Can we move this deadline to Tuesday? And I sometimes, in as nice of a way as possible, explain that if I have a Monday deadline, it means that I'll be spending the weekend thinking about it and I won't really be able to have a break with my family, that kind of thing. And so it's just important to set that boundary. For me, I make a rule of no Monday deadlines, and that means I actually get a weekend. So yeah, I'd say put your operating hours up on your website, and that communicates to others that you actually keep regular office hours. It actually makes you look more professional. And of course, be willing to make exceptions. If a good opportunity comes, if the New Yorker calls and says they need an illustration in half an hour, do it. I would do that. If the New Yorker called me today, I would set everything else aside and just do it, because that's a dream client for me. Would I do New Yorker illustrations repeatedly like that? Probably not. I'd probably come to a point and be like, okay, I've done it. I've checked that off my list. And I don't think I want to, I want some sleep now. I want a weekend and I want to spend time with my family. So, and I guess one more point to this is that when you're starting out as an illustrator, you definitely will have to make more compromises with your time. Not only are you going to be spending more time illustrating because of your inexperience, it's going to take you longer to do things and learn things and get at things, get at your final ideas and stuff like that. But it's just the kind of jobs that are coming to you will probably be shorter turnaround, expect more from you for less, like less pay, to be specific. And I think you just have to do your time when you're starting out, and that's okay. Like my early career of being a designer and illustrator was just many, many, many late nights. And still there are illustrators and designers today who are super experienced who still don't go to bed until 2 a.m. I think of John Contino. I think he works like crazy hours, and he has 2 kids, he's married, and he's still got that hustle in him, and I think that's amazing. And but I'd say like that spirit of hustle, you need to have that early on, and just be willing to, it's not about just doing what the client asks. You're in it because you're excited about learning. You want to do the best job you can. You want to outdo yourself. You want to outdo their expectations. And along with that territory just comes a lot of late nights and missed weekends. Okay, guys. I think this is the last question from Instagram. Then I'm going to move on to the YouTube live stream questions here, just in time for 10 o'clock. So if you've been here for the full hour, thanks for sticking around. Ezgi, I see your question. I see your question, Barbara and Stefania. I'm going to start getting to those just after this last Instagram question. So hang in there, guys. So I'm just going to summarize this question, which comes from Kiki, who lives in Italy. So she said, I didn't get the chance to study fine arts, design, or anything like these, but my dream is to become an illustrator. So I'm trying to give myself an education to improve via Skillshare and similar websites. In your opinion, what are the basic and advanced topics I need to know? I'm sure many are trying to do the same. And just like me, they get lost in a huge amount of things that can be studied. Well put, Kiki. I think that's exactly the problem, is when you're starting out, you don't know what you don't know. It's just overwhelming. It's like when I go to the big box grocery store, and I came for maybe carrots or something like that, but because there's so many options of what, carrots is a bad example. I'm trying to think. Here's one thing. When I go to get like a sports hydration mix or like a protein mix for my workouts, I go to the health aisle, and then there's just like all these things with different vitamins and proteins and vegan this and branched amino acids or whatever. Like there's all these weird things that I don't know what they are, what they do, or why I should get that or over that. What I end up doing is actually just walking away from the aisle every time without anything and think, I'll just drink Gatorade. And it's just easier to go to like this basic cheap stuff that's probably really bad for me than to you know, actually get something that's really going to help me recover and build up my muscle or whatever it is. And I think that that's really just the problem with things where we feel out of our depth. We're overwhelmed by the options and the choice. So I'd say, to answer your question, Kiki, the good news is that there really isn't any one route to becoming an illustrator. So it's not like you need to go to school to be an illustrator in the way that you need to go to school to become a doctor or an engineer. I think going to art school or taking conventional classes in art or design is helpful. It's what I did, and I think that it is important. But increasingly, education is ridiculously expensive, and there's just so much you can learn online now. So be encouraged. You could probably get the equivalent of a degree just by taking online classes and taking the odd class in person at a local college or something like that. Of course, when you're actually able to go and do that in public again, which I hope is soon. I'm just going to give you a few starting points. And these just like assume you're starting totally from scratch. Maybe you have some experience or art history or something under your belt. Maybe you don't. I'm just going to give you some starting points that correspond to my own journey. And I've kind of, you had asked what the beginning and advanced starting points would be. I'm going to break these up into different categories: theory, technology, technique, and I'm going to add in people and podcasts as well. So for theory, first is to learn about the elements and principles of design. And that's, you know, things like shape, color, repetition, harmony. Look it up. There's going to be so much available on that. Elements and principles of design. The second thing in theory is, and this is a bit more of a technique thing, but I'm going to say life drawing. Life drawing is really important because it's just it's the essential illustrator skill is to be able to draw from life. You don't have to be good at it. You just have to get better at it and learn how to see. And again, I think that might be more of a technique thing. So the next theory thing is color theory. Learn about color theory. You don't have to be a colorist. You don't have to be an expert in color right away. Just learn about the basics, color harmonies, primary colors, secondary colors, tertiary colors. And then any book on color theory, though it might be very technical, will help you learn some basic ideas of how color works. And that's really important. Finally, learn about art history. You can go super down the rabbit hole in this. You know, you could start all the way back in ancient cultures like Rome and Greece, or prehistory like the caves in Lascaux, all the way to medieval, to Renaissance, to Enlightenment, to Rococo. Like you could learn about, like I'm just spouting these things off because I have a very cursory knowledge of these things. I actually don't know a lot about them, but I'm conversational in some ideas of art history, and that actually helps me inform my work, and it helps me decode and understand other people's illustration. And when you know about art history, because illustration is a form of art, you're able to make more informed choices, and you become better at knowing how to, you know, what things might mean in a piece. You get better at understanding political connotations in art. You might get better. I mean, one thing that I learned when I started getting into art history, design, craft history when I was in school, is I realized that art history is history. All of, like, if you don't, I've never taken like a proper history class outside of high school. And I've learned so much about the world and about politics and and eras and just like life just through art history. Now, I'm gonna say, I don't actually have the cover for this book, but it's a history of graphic design. So this is a very graphic design centric history, and it's, it kind of mostly walks us through the 20th century movements of design. And I'm sure there must be a more modern edition than this. This probably gets cut off around the early 2000s. But a book like this is really a great read. It looks really thick, but there's lots of pictures and stuff, but you really get a very trade specific history. If you're intimidated by the idea of like the big art history movements or the big movements of art history, just sticking with industry specific history. Maybe there's even an illustration history now, I don't know. You learn about the important people and players along the way, and through that you actually start learning about different techniques, different styles, why these styles emerged, why they used the techniques they used. In graphic design history, you learn a ton about type, and so there's just so much you can learn. And I'm just talking about theory now, so let's move on to technology. Technology, I think you should definitely learn Photoshop, Illustrator, and Procreate. And you can say, instead of Photoshop, do some affinity program, and same with Illustrator. Or instead of Procreate, you could use Fresco or Paper. I think the important thing is learn software. And if you're going to learn any software, if there's any software that is sort of standard, it is Photoshop, Illustrator, and Procreate. And I know I talked a little bit about this in a previous question, but just having some understanding of how these work is obviously going to be important. And I think we're all going to end up being digital illustrators to some degree. Even if you work on paper with paint, you're going to need computers to make that digital and look good along the way. So in terms of technique, and this goes beyond the kind of technology on screen, this goes off screen. I think learn life drawing. So drawing from life, whether still life or figures, like human figures. Learn various drawing techniques. So learn how to draw with pencil, ink, charcoal. If you're going to learn painting technique, I think gouache is a really good technique for graphic artists, illustrators, designers to learn. Gouache is really easy to work with. It's opaque. You can get primary colors that mix into secondary and tertiary colors really well. It's kind of what we started out with in art school, so that's kind of why I'm saying that. I actually don't paint. I don't use gouache, but I have in the past, and it's really fun to work with. And it's something worth trying your hand at. You might like it. Another technique, of course, is learning lettering, hand lettering, calligraphy. And then if you really want to go over and above, touch on some graphic design and typography. And I've already talked a lot about this today. So the next thing is people. Look up some people, important people in illustration and commercial art. And for me, I know that there are so many others, but for me, my hero is Paul Rand. Paul Rand is just such an influence on me. And I think anyone who reads him, studies him, will benefit and learn a lot about commercial art and illustration. He was not a very conventional illustrator, much more, I like to call him a commercial artist, a graphic designer. And this book, A Designer's Art, just has essays that he's written along with, a little bit of show and tell of his work. And I think to study him, you do well. Saul Steinberg is another one of my heroes. Saul Steinberg has some videos up on, he didn't make them because he's from a long time ago, from the 60s or whatever. But Saul Steinberg, his thoughts on illustration and image making have been very influential on me. Another person who's been super influential on me is Paula Scher, a graphic designer. She's with Pentagram Design in New York, and she's just brilliant. She has lots of talks, probably on like 99U, but if you just look up Paula Scher, Scher, check her out. And another one of my heroes is Myra Kalman. I love her work. Again, check her out, and of course, find out who your people are, and study them. Who are you influenced by? Who are you inspired by? Who are their influences? What are they saying? What kind of resources? What kind of breadcrumb trails have they left on the internet? Follow them and just go down that rabbit hole. So I did say I'd recommend some podcasts. There's just one podcast I think that you need to know about, and that you probably already know about it. I'd like to know if someone can guess in the live chat what podcast I'm going to say. Just curious if you would recommend a podcast for creatives starting out. What would you recommend? Creative Pep Talk. There it is. There it is. Lots of creative pep talk. That's right. Andy J Pizza has given so much to the creative community. I've been following his podcast for the last, probably since the beginning, since he was recording on his iPhone. And he's just a fountain of information about going through the experience of becoming a creative. I mean, he kind of just walks you through his own life and his own journey, and he's got so much to share. And yeah, super grateful for him. I would definitely say start with him, and he just will lead you to so many new insights in illustration, and hopefully these lead to questions that you ask, and then you learn more. So I know I've just given you like a fire hose of, I tried to make it a summary in terms of like where to start if you didn't go to art school, but hopefully this gives you some starting points and leads you to ask more questions, and kind of just help that journey and that process of learning snowball from here. Okay, Stefania asks, hey Tom, what are your favorite books on illustration? Would you like to give us a sort of must-read list? So I've already started giving you guys book recommendations, and I have books to show you guys, so this is perfect. So I've already talked about Paul Rand, A Designer's Art, super important book. Anyone in graphic design or illustration should read Paul Rand. Lisa Congdon's Art Inc. is great if you want to learn about the business side of illustration and creativity in general. If you want to really nerd out about type, I didn't show you guys this book before. This is not illustration based, but this is The Elements of Typographic Style. It's a tome. It's just like thick with information, poetically written by Robert Bringhurst about typography. So if you really want to nerd out and be a typographer's typographer, read this book. I have a confession to make. I've read a few pages of it. I like to own it on my shelf because it looks good there, but classic book. This is a good book for anyone just wanting to study visual, like graphic design, graphic arts, commercial art, that kind of thing. Obviously, graphic design, illustration, graphic design have so much overlap. And so books like these are great. Again, very oriented toward the student, the new student. And so I think it's very accessible, and even gives you exercises to work through if you wanted to. I've talked about Find Your Artistic Voice. Another good business book that's been really popular amongst creatives, designers, illustrators is Freelance and Business and Stuff by the Hood sisters. And yeah, I think that's a nice, helpful, accessible book. And I've referenced this a million times. This is an older edition, very wacky cover, but the handbook, what is it called? It's the most complicated title I've ever seen. I wish they'd change it, but it's the Graphic Artists Guild Handbook, Pricing and Ethical Guidelines. And they may be up to edition 15 or 16 now. And they tell you just things like how to price your work for different industries, different trades, whether you're doing pattern design, textiles, illustration, graphic design, things like that. So very handy book. I think this is an essential, especially if you have questions about pricing and contracts. 2 more books, and then I'll move on to another question. This book has changed my life in terms of being able to construct lettering on the computer, and just giving me actually more than just lettering and just using the pen tool. This has just been really helpful, just because if you can use the pen tool to construct perfect letter forms, you can use the pen tool to create perfect shapes in general. And so I think books like this. Another book that I don't have that I'd like is by Martina Flor. She's also a digital lettering artist, kind of like Jessica Heish, but Martina Flor, I don't remember her app. It might be The Golden Secrets of Lettering or something like that, but I would look her up as well. And then again, for lettering, I had these books actually because of the person asking about lettering. This is an oldie but a goodie. I'm sure there's newer references about hand lettering. This is from 15 years ago or something like that. It's old, but it really introduces you to this idea of kind of this grungy, punky kind of hand lettering, and the different folks who make it and the different styles. And it's just really inspiring to see what other people, how people letter in a more naive and non-technical way. So those are some books I had to share with you guys. Awesome question. Thanks, Stefania. I'm going to move on to Barbara Harris's question. What are your organization or workflow tools, and how do you organize tasks and day-to-day deadlines? I got to say, Barbara, I don't have like a specific tool that I use in terms of workflow. I just kind of have a rhythm that I follow. And I've got to be honest, there are days when I'm totally useless and disorganized, and there are days when I'm on the ball. But generally speaking, my best tool, so to speak, is having a clear block of time that is mine to work in. So I start work, these days it is 8 and I end at 5. At other times it's been 9 to 5. Early on in the pandemic, when we first started kind of self-isolating and trying to figure out how I would work and how my wife would find time to work, I was working even half days and stuff like that, but that's a different story. Right now I work 8 to 5, and within that I do anything I need to do to get my job done, and then after that it's family time. So, you know, in terms of staying organized, I have Post-it notes that I stick up on the wall in sort of a calendar formation, and right now that's helped me sort of see my week ahead. Another thing that I do is I just put sticky notes on my desktop and I write my goals or my to-do list for the day. So it's really low tech, just writing to-do lists and having a time frame in which to do it. Yeah, and otherwise just, I've been doing this long enough that I just know if I have a deadline, how long I need to build up to it. And again, being super honest, even though I keep regular hours, there's often times when it is the 11th hour and I'm working to make a deadline, just because I'm trying, even though I might have finished the real work hours ago, I'm doing what I can to make it perfect, or I can't stop looking at it because I've been looking at it for so long. So I have to keep playing around with it. So that does happen also. But generally speaking, you need to set goals, have to-do lists, write them down somewhere, and have set time in which to do them. So a question from Taryn Brench is, I'd love to know how you get in the bigger client projects like advertising and packaging. I've had good feedback when contacting design agencies who commission this, but never seem to get past that. So that's a good question. And it really is all about connections that you have with people, and just staying on their radar and showing that you have what it takes to do the kinds of jobs that they want to do. And sometimes you get one before the other. Like I think I had connections before I had actually proven myself, and those connections gave me a chance because they liked what I had done on other things, maybe that were not quite as sophisticated. Another thing is that I worked as a designer at a design studio for a while, and just because I'm there working as part of a team, I'm working on projects that are naturally much bigger than I would have been able to get as a freelancer. And so I have that big project experience without having to take on that work all on my own or find that work all on my own. And then later you get to sort of put that on your portfolio anyway. So I think that's an important thing. Like one way to supercharge your illustration career is to be a designer first and work for a studio, because that experience in a studio, whether big or small, is really going to teach you so much more than you ever could on your own. Apart from that, I do have agents that help find me work, help find me these bigger projects. And so while big publishers or big advertising agencies may not have known about me at first, they knew about my agencies and of course saw me on their roster and then thought that guy's work would work for what we want to do. Okay, so thanks for your question, Taryn. Okay, so Ezgi's asking, how do you illustrate an imaginary scene when you don't have reference pictures? This might be a question for your upcoming Skillshare class, and that's absolutely true. I've been asked so many times to the point where I know I need to make a Skillshare class about is how do you basically illustrate scenes? You know, I've obviously shown how to draw people, how to draw spot illustrations, and these usually don't have much in the background. So I think the next level up is how do you draw illustrations with backgrounds? You actually might notice that the majority of my illustrations have some white space in it, if not mostly white space. So I'm not the kind of illustrator to illustrate lavish, rich scenes naturally. I have done them. I do them. And I said do. I have done them. And so certainly my approach to this really, I don't think it can be summarized here, but I would say, or I can't explain it fully here, but basically, I'll put it this way. I'm not the kind of person to draw full scenes. It's just not what I like to do. I don't like getting into many different details and moving parts in an illustration. My natural tendency is to make more graphic images that are about one thing than about lots of things. But when I have to do those things, a more detailed scene, what I do is I try to give myself as much of an opportunity not to have to do that as possible, if that makes sense. So I think about what big shapes can I add into this? Put it another way, which is actually the way you should be thinking about any illustration, is what is the subject of my illustration? What is the focus? So it might be someone running, and that person has to be in an environment, like an urban environment or a park. So you have to draw that background as well. So the most important thing for me is, where is this runner and how do I put them front and center? So first of all, establish what your subject is and make sure that it is, without a question, the most obvious thing about your illustration. You don't want to make an illustration about a runner and then have them tiny, and then you have this huge scene where there's lots of people. So the next thing, of course, is to establish the setting. And here you need to think about hierarchy. So I have the runner. This is where I'm going to spend the most effort in terms of making it stand out, whether through details or bold colors. The background is going to have to kind of be second fiddle to that. So you don't need to get into too much details. You just need enough in the background to set the scene. And that might mean a suggestion of a path, some grass, a little bit of water, maybe a fountain, clouds, birds, silhouette of buildings and background. So you just, you're talking about how to do this without references. Well, the answer is actually, I don't do very many illustrations without references. I always start with references. And if you've taken Sweet Spots, you know that I spend a lot of time doing what I call free sketching, where I'm just drawing from reference images, but not working out my composition yet. I'm just downloading the information from my reference images, drawing them so that I have a repertoire of images in my head. And then when I go to sketch out my final composition with, say, background buildings or a fountain or that kind of thing, I've already internalized the images that I've copied. And now I can just draw them the way I draw them naturally. I'm not really thinking about how to draw it realistically or exactly as it was in the photo. And then, of course, at this time in my experience at this stage, I actually have built up a repertoire of how I draw certain things that I just reference. And this is what I talked about way back earlier today, where I've kind of the style that I work in is based on symbols and shapes and a way of drawing certain things that I can turn to. I say, well, when I draw a building, I usually just draw a zigzag, like a blocky thing, and then add a few windows. And that's what I do. I don't really have to think about it anymore. It's just what I do. It's different if I now need to draw a building as a focus, then I have to think about how to draw that as a more primary subject. And so I guess the summary of it is, more important than your background is setting what your illustration is about. What is the main subject? And then your background should be sort of secondary to that. And you are perhaps using lighter, dimmer colors. Your lines aren't as dark. Everything is going to be pulled back a bit so that your subject stands out. So that's just like tip of the iceberg. And I know that there's different, I would approach different illustrations and scenes differently depending on what needs to come forward and how much of that background I need to show. But I hope that helps. Thank you for your question. Okay. This comes from Green and Pink. And they ask, do you think it is better to have a consistent style or voice, especially in characters, to get noticed from art directors and publishers and eventually hired to have a bit of variety? I think, yes, it is very important to have a consistent style or a voice. I think we've talked about that already today. So yes, have a consistent style and voice that becomes your calling card, that people recognize you from. I think that's the value that you add. But I guess you're asking, is that kind of your foot in the door, and then you can go and be more experimental and have variety? I think that's a strategy, right? Like, you might have a thing that you get good at and get known for, but then by the time you might get commissioned for a job, you might be inspired to try something a little different. And I would say, if you want to do that, if you want to kind of branch out, have that conversation with your art director before you get into like making the final artwork. Like, show in your sketches different approaches that you'd like to try. And if it's way out there in terms of what your art director or client maybe thought of when they called you up, you might have to kind of build up a case for yourself, show them examples of what you mean in some way or another, because what you don't want is to have, you don't want to do a bait and switch, right? You don't want to sell yourself on one style, and then when the client says, I want you to create this such and such, and then you create that such and such, but it's not at all what they hired you for, obviously they're going to be disappointed, and that's not going to go down so well. So as you want to be experimental, I think that's really great. You just want to make sure you're communicating along the way what you're doing before you get too far ahead in the job. But yes, I think it's good to have variety, and I do that all the time. I pivot a little bit to the left or to the right, depending on sometimes even just my mood or what I feel like the particular job calls for. I really think that being flexible and adaptable is important. It's just a matter of how you communicate that and how well that fits within your voice, because you can do two very different things, and they can both be very much your voice. And I think part of it might be just selling your client on how this particular approach that you're trying to do, this new approach, is special to their brand, and it responds to something, one of their brand pillars or something important or critical to that particular campaign or project. So great question. Okay, Tim Rush says, do you have set boundaries in place to help you stay focused on your important tasks at hand while working from home? And I think I've talked about, maybe this question was asked before, I already kind of touched on this. I basically just have a block of time that's mine to say no to other things. I have permission to sort of be a jerk and ignore other things that are going on in the home because I am at home. My studio's been in the house for 2 years now. So I've gotten used to, and my family's gotten used to, my studio here is actually my laundry room. I've changed my camera angle here so that it's a little bit more creative looking when I'm doing videos, but I'm actually, I'm going way too much into details here, but basically my computer is on my laundry machine right now. But when my family comes into the laundry room to do whatever, feed the cat, do the laundry, walk out into the garage, I have permission to sort of, not be totally present with them in that moment because I'm working. This is my office space. This is my cubicle, and I need that. I need that kind of separation. So it's important for me to have that space, that safe space to be able to get things done. I think more important, I mean, what you need to summarize is a space that's your own and a block of time that's your own. You need space and time to do your job. So thank you for your question. And that was from Tim. Okay, so we're going to keep on going. I think what we'll do is I'll just make this a 2-hour video. As long as I'll go up until 11 a.m. and then call it a day. But so we have another 25 minutes. This next question comes from Wen, and they ask, it would be great if you could share a bad experience during your illustration career that made a positive overall impact to you and made you grow and learn a lot. Oh man, I feel like I might have to go away and like think about that. I mean, I can't think off the top of my head a really bad experience that stands out. Well, actually I can. And some of you who've been following the channel would have caught back in December when I was working through some challenges I had with the kids book that I've been illustrating for over a year. So I just want to say today, that book is, it's with the client, it's in the bag, it's being printed, it's all good. Everything turned out amazingly. The client and I had a good chat about it, and we've worked everything out. But the story goes, I did a whole version of the book, finished illustrations, according to brief, and that took about 6 months. So that was last July. They loved it so much that they wanted to change the format of the book from kind of partial spot illustrations throughout the book to full spread illustrations every page. And I was kind of flattered, of course, that they wanted to go through that they wanted to feature my illustration even bigger and bolder. I thought that was really awesome, but really kind of deflated because I thought I'd finished the project, had it under my belt, and I could move on to the next thing. So of course they offered more compensation for it. They were being totally fair. It was just not what I thought I was doing for the next 6 months after that. Anyway, so I did a whole second version of the book, but I had said, if I do a second version, I'm going to need to kind of change gears a little bit and kind of enter into this book from a different space. And so I actually went in and changed the look of the art a little bit because I thought that was going to be more effective for full spreads. And they gave me full trust to do that. They never checked in until 5 or 6 months later when I showed them the art. And that would have been November, December. And when they saw it, they're like, your old style was better. This is not at all what we want. We need you to go through the book and change it again. And at that point, I was and this is when I created a reaction video about this, trying to process it here on YouTube, which I've since taken down because it was so raw. But basically, I was just like, how have I spent a year on this and done 2 full versions of full illustrations, final art, and I'm still not done. Now I have to do it again. Like, that has probably been the hardest moment in my illustration career, just learning that. And I was so confident that what I was making they would love, and to learn when they saw it that they weren't super excited by it in the way that I was, really made me question my whole ability as a designer. It really had me just like, well, if I love this, but they think it's not as good as what they saw before, what does that mean about me and my taste and my ability to discern what's good quality and not good quality? And through that process, I think I just learned a lot about illustrating kids' books. Illustrating kids' books is so different than illustrating for advertising. There's longer deadlines and just more moving parts. You make a lot less money doing it, so mistakes seem to be a lot more expensive. So it was a very expensive mistake for me to make. And that second time when I had to go into final art, or that when I showed them that second final art and had to go into it a third time, that was all on me. All that mistake, I couldn't charge them anymore. And so I think it's hard to put into words, but basically through that really hard process, it really helped me see what to focus on when I'm making my illustrations for this kids book, for kids books in general, and especially with this client. And so now I'm working on a second book with them. I'm in the early sketches phase, and I have so much more guidance internally as I'm going through this because of that experience. So I wish I could show you by example what I'm talking about. But the biggest positive outcome from that very, very hard, challenging experience is just being that what you learn through that pain. I mean, nothing teaches you more than a hard, painful experience. And just their reaction to what I showed them taught me a lot about who they are as a client, what they need, what they're looking for, and what strengths they saw in me. And the strength that I thought I was bringing to the table wasn't the strength they were hiring me to do. And I really struggled with that. I wanted to have this style that was really fun and kind of chunky and naive and fast and intuitive and from the hip. And they wanted something that was a little bit more careful and layered and precious. And so I felt like that approach was not sustainable for me because it was so detailed. And I'm like I said, I'm much more of a single image, single idea in an image kind of person. And so for me to go and get into that space is harder for me. But I also learned that that's something I can do very well when I do it, when I apply myself. And they really believe it's going to be like a good book. They believe in the book. They believe in that style. And so I had to set aside what I felt the right artistic vision for that book was, and realize that it was it's really a collaboration. And that's really hard for me as someone who feels like as I'm getting more mature and more experienced, I should be able to call the shots more and be the artist, and to be told by my publisher what they want, which is different. That's just sometimes it's hard. It's just hard to be told that, not that you're wrong, but this is a group effort, and you're actually really good at this, even though you may not think that you are, that kind of thing. So that's been a really challenging experience that turned out amazingly. And like I said, as hard as that was, they hired me for the second book. This book is a book about Egyptian mummies and how they're made. And I even have a third book contract signed with them, which is to be determined in terms of what the book will be about. But all this to say, we have a great relationship, and almost because of that experience, we bonded through that, and we have a good. We're very good at communicating. I think that's really the takeaway, is like you can weather any challenge with a client as long as you can communicate about it and stay kind. So Thank you for that awesome question. Okay. The question comes from Laura, and I appreciate when you guys actually write question in front of your questions and I can find them easy. Laura asks, do you think one has to choose between graphic design and illustration? Is it weird to be a good illustrator, but also no brand strategy? Hell no. I think you need to, you do well to learn both graphic design and illustration. And in my opinion, I know we talk about these two things as separate things, and there are definitely like individual aspects of them, but the way I go about it is the same. It's all creative problem solving. And again, my hero, Paul Rand, he was what I would call a commercial artist. He was a graphic designer. He understood brand strategy, but he was also an image maker, an illustrator. He created fictional images by constructing them through, different illustration, collage techniques and drawing techniques. And I think to be a good illustrator means you need to be a good graphic designer. You need to be able to communicate ideas to people quickly. You need to help them learn about whatever your subject is in an efficient way. And graphic design, similarly, is not just about putting type on a page and making good layouts or good websites. It's about setting a mood and a tone, and that's what illustrators are good with, is like setting a mood and a tone. And I'm being very cursory about this, but the short answer is it is not weird to be good at brand strategy and also be an illustrator. And I think that gives you a competitive edge that helps you in this competitive field. So thank you, Laura. Great question. Okay, this comes from someone from Russia. I see Cyrillic letters here, and I don't want to try to pronounce it, but thank you for your question. Do you feel sometimes like you don't want to work or need vacation from being creative all the time, or just don't feel inspired to create something? If it happens, what do you do to get back on track? And I'm going to be totally honest with you guys. I feel like that almost all the time, because my job is illustrating as creative. It's something I have to do. And I have to force myself all the time I have to motivate myself to get into it. And the best way I find to get into it is just to will away the other distractions, turn off my phone if I have to, put do not disturb, activate that on my computer, shut down mail, and then find my entry point into whatever the task I have to do is. And so I think one of the hardest things to do with any project is just to start. You get the brief, and the next thing is you actually have to start. And so what I do is one of the things that actually helps me through a process from start to finish, whether I want to do it or not, is just having a process. And I feel like I've talked about this before, but basically I have very specific stages in my routine for a given project that I follow. And so I know what I have to do at any given point, what my next step will be. So once I get a brief from a client, my next thing is to just summarize or write out that brief to myself so I've understood it and all the things that I need to do in terms of like, what is my creative task here? What is it that I'm doing? What is the deliverable? That's my first thing. The next thing that I do is I go into research and discovery, and that means finding image references, reading Wikipedia entries on a subject, basically learning as much as I can about my subject without having to do anything creative at this point. It's really just passive. And I think that's really an important part of the stage, because it's at that point where my interest starts getting piqued. Once I start actually studying and looking at images, I'm like, oh, that's really neat. I didn't know about that. And then I go down rabbit holes, and I do try to give myself enough time to get distracted and go down rabbit holes with this research and discovery phase. And when I come out of the surface, when I surface from this part of the stage, what I have hopefully are some images that I've collected or notes that I've collected, and I put them in a folder. And my next thing is just to start drawing from these. And this is what I call free sketching. And just at first drawing can be, it's just like, I don't want to draw. It's going to take too much focus. But once you get into that focus, it's like a switch switches. It flicks a switch in your head where it's like, now you're focused and you don't want to do anything else. And so at this point, I'm drawing from images, and I can really get into that once I get into it. But there is that resistance that I have to push through at first. There's always, once I get into each next stage of my process, there's a bit of resistance that I just have to will myself through. But the only way to will yourself through to do that is to do it. And so on and so on and so on until I get to the end of the project. And I think the reality is, most of the time I don't really want to be doing what I'm doing, but it's not that what I'm doing is unenjoyable. It's just that there's resistance. And I think his name is Stephen Pressman. He has a book called The War of Art. And in that book, he talks about this, he names this presence as being resistance. It's this presence in our life that, like a demon, always tries to pull us away from the task that we're supposed to be doing. And if we can recognize that resistance is pulling us away, we can say, no, I'm focusing on doing this, and I'm doing it. And I think that's a huge thing. And then, of course, there are times when I just want to take a break and a vacation, and then I should. I mean, that's what taking evenings and weekends is all about. You can't, I can't just be always working without recharging my batteries, because then I'll burn out. So thank you very much for your question. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left. I guess now is a good chance for maybe one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. So, all right. Well, let's just call it. Let's close this thing off then. And again, thank you very much for joining us today. If you've joined in kind of part way, I just want to thank you for being here and sticking through this super long session. There's just so much to go through, and it was really fun. I love answering your questions. My name is Tom Froese, and again, I post videos here answering your questions about illustration. If you're new here, be sure to check out the rest of my videos on this channel. And if you've enjoyed this particular video or this live stream, please smash that like button, and be sure to subscribe if you want to know when new videos drop here. And of course, I will be doing future live streams. And I think this is, even though it's super rough and choppy, and I say a lot during these live streams, I actually really like these because it's more than just talking to a camera. I really feel like I'm hanging out with you guys. And yeah, thank you so much, guys. Keep making great work and keep asking great questions. And because this is the COVID-19 edition, stay safe, stay well, and wash your hands. All right. Bye-bye, guys.